How are you? It's good to be with you. We had the day off yesterday, and so we'll be doing a double daf tonight. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Tuesday night with Passover coming fast? Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in New Hampshire, Stephen in Waterville, Maine, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Bella in Florida, Sharon, an exhausted from Pesach cleaning shout out from Lebanon, New Jersey. Our house has been topsy-turvy for days. Nina is doing an incredible job. She managed to turn over the kitchen yesterday. I'm just helping here and there where I can. She's doing an extraordinary amount of work. I mean, getting a house ready for Passover, not for the faint of heart. But that's what we got to do because even a little bit of chametz is way too much chametz. Of course, sometimes we'll miss a little bit inadvertently despite our best efforts. And that's why we'll do that nullification of whatever chametz we may have missed. We'll do that on Thursday night when we do the search by candlelight for any remaining chametz, and we'll do it again on Friday morning, Erev Pesach, like we talked about so many times in our journey through Tractate Pesachim. Who else? Rick is in Chicagoland. Paula in the Great Northwest. David in South Bend. Other Paula in Chicago. Tom in PA. Debbie in Toms River, New Jersey, where we are very busy preparing for Pesach. James in Annapolis. Paula says, always love your musical choices. Wasn't that good? So we're working our way now through Eitan Katz's Unplugged, and that was the song Al Tira. Randy, shalom from Florida. Please include Moshe Reuven ben Menucha in your prayers. May Moshe Reuven ben Menucha have a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery of whatever is ailing him. John in Maine, Charles in Omaha, Brad in Detroit, Karen in Northern California, Lucy in Minnesota. Over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Yitzhak in Kansas City. Excuse me, and Yitzhak is just running out to the store for missing Pesach ingredients. We'll catch the replay. Okay. Excuse me. We're also happy. Our daughter came home from Israel last night. She's been spending the year in Jerusalem studying, and she gets to take a Passover holiday with us, which is great. And I was actually able to study today's page with her this afternoon as I was preparing. We studied it together by her request. She wanted to do Daf Yomi with Dad, and that was so touching for me. It was so sweet. Okay, let's get into it. All right, where are we holding? So today we're going to be doing pages 35 and 36 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud, the laws of yibum, levirate marriage. We're actually going to complete chapter 3 and open chapter 4. We're picking this up at the bottom of 34b. Finishing our discussion of Mishna number 11 here in chapter 3, which was the curious case of the bride switched at the wedding. Specifically, two brothers betrothed to two sisters, and then the brides were switched, and accidentally, as the Gemara emphasized. But nonetheless, it happened, and so a man was betrothed to one woman, which is to say married, even though they hadn't consummated the union, they were married according to Jewish law, and now he had relations with this other woman who's not his wife, and he ends up being liable to 4 sin offerings for 4 transgressions. It was inadvertent, but he slept with a married woman, he slept with his brother's wife, because she was betrothed to his brother. He slept with his own wife's sister, and they added the circumstance that the woman was menstruating, so he violated the laws of Nida. So therefore, 4 violations with one accidental act of intercourse, as we have seen. And the sages have now been discussing various ramifications of this curious case. Okay. So Shmuel said, and all of those women who had sexual intercourse, and there is therefore a concern that they might be pregnant, must wait 3 months before marrying, right? Now that they had sex, basically extramarital sex, since they had sex with a woman that was not their betrothed, what if she got pregnant? They have to be sure that she didn't. Why? Because if she did, so a Jewish woman who's married, having sex with a Jewish man who's not her husband, if they conceive a child, that child will be a mamzer, which is a terrible calamity to visit on an innocent child. Won't be able to marry another Jew unless it's also a mamzer. And they need to be sure. So if she went right back to her own spouse and they had relations, and you could never be sure who conceived the baby. So they make her wait 3 months. So as to differentiate between a child born from the previous intercourse and a child born from the marriage. But not in the case of a female convert who is a minor and a female released slave who is a minor. Although it is possible that they had sexual intercourse, they cannot become pregnant in any case. Right, so they're just talking about this rule of women who have sex, with 2 men in a short period of time, and you're not going to be sure who they could conceive by. But if it happened to a minor, which we saw was rape, right? Even if she was willing, but you do that with a minor, it's rape. Whether she's a Jew or a convert or a slave, they don't make her, wait 3 months before getting married. Because she's a minor, right? Meaning that she couldn't get pregnant. I mean, here what they mean by a minor is not somebody who's under 18, but prepubescent, and that's why she couldn't get pregnant. Hold on a second. Let me make an adjustment on my screen. That was odd. Okay. So although it is possible that they had sexual intercourse shortly before they come to the new spouse, they cannot become pregnant from it in any case. However, a female Israelite, a Jewish woman, who was a minor and had intercourse must wait 3 months like all other women. And the Gemara asks, and with regard to what situation is this statement referring? If it is referring to a minor who was released from her marriage by refusal, as a minor girl who was married to a man by her mother and brothers may refuse to remain married to her husband until she reaches majority. But didn't Shmuel say that she is not required to wait 3 months? And if it is referring to a woman who received a bill of divorce while she was a minor, didn't Shmuel already state this law one time? Why would he repeat this ruling? As Shmuel said, a female minor who refused her husband need not wait 3 months before her second marriage, because while she was married to him as a minor and then refused, so that never was a marriage, right? So it's not somebody who's coming out of marriage. It's considered as if she never was married. So she need not wait 3 months before her second marriage. But if he gave her a bill of divorce, then she must wait 3 months, so as not to make a distinction between an adult divorcee and a minor divorcee. That's a rabbinic decree that they said, well, if a get was involved, if a divorce was involved, then she has to wait 3 months like any other divorcee. So rather, it must be that this ruling is referring to a female minor who was involved in licentious sexual intercourse. And although there is no possibility for her to become pregnant, what is going on with my screen? I don't know. It's odd. Okay. And although there is no possibility for her to become pregnant, the sages issued a rabbinic decree requiring the 3-month waiting period for a female minor due to this requirement for a female adult who engaged in promiscuous sexual acts. The Gemara asks, now we're on 35a. The Gemara asks, and do we issue a decree with regard to a female minor due to the ruling of a female adult? Why do we need this decree? But didn't we learn in the Mishna, if there were female minors who could not bear children, we return them immediately to their husbands. And this indicates that there is no concern for pregnancy. And the sages did not issue a decree in this case. And Rav Giddel said that Rav said this was a provisional edict issued in exigent circumstances, and therefore one cannot extrapolate from the case in the Mishnah to other situations. And the Gemara immediately responds, can one assume by inference that there was such an occurrence as our Mishnah, that two brothers betrothed two sisters and somehow accidentally switched the brides on their wedding night and slept with the wrong woman? This is understood to be a hypothetical situation to test our understanding of the law, to test the sage's understanding of the law. Are you telling me that this actually happened, and that's the reason why we can't extend a ruling from this situation to other situations? Because sometimes they'll make a ruling for one particular situation that's so unusual and extreme that you can't extrapolate from that a law that you can apply in general cases. It was for those exigent circumstances. Are you saying that this actually happened and was such an exigent circumstance type of case? It would seem from the Mishnah that this was merely a possibility and it was not an actual occurrence. For if it actually happened, it would have been appropriate for the Mishnah to relate the actual case. It didn't sound like a case. It didn't call it an incident. Rather, the ruling in the Mishnah is like a provisional edict in that switching of wives, such as described in our Mishnah, is uncommon. And in cases that are not common, the sages do not issue a decree. Therefore, right, what is a decree? It's to build a fence around the Torah to protect people from situations that arise in the world where we can predict that a certain number of people will make a mistake and end up violating a Torah law. So they built the decree as a fence around the Torah to protect people from coming to violate a Torah law. Therefore, in the case of the Mishnah, the female minors were not required to wait. Some say another version of what was taught. Shmuel said all women must wait 3 months, except for a female convert who is an adult, right? 3 months between the last time you had sex with a man and then your marriage to a new man, which is going to allow you to sleep with him. Right, so whether it was a divorce or whether the man died or a minor performed a refusal, for whatever it was, since they didn't have any DNA tests back then, you needed to be sure who the father was. So it should never happen, even if she was married, because otherwise it would have been permissible. For example, a married woman, had sex with her husband. God forbid, the next day he died. Now she's a free woman. Let's say they had children, right? So she's a free woman. There's no yibum situation. She could marry some other guy the next day, and then it wouldn't be extramarital sex if she slept with her new husband. But the sages made her wait so that they could be sure who the father was, because there's a lot of implications of who the father is for various other areas of Jewish law. So Shmuel said all women must wait 3 months, except for a female convert who is an adult and a freed maidservant who is an adult. These women need not wait. Why? Because a convert, when you go into the mikveh and come out a Jew for the first time, your previous familial relations are severed. It's as if they never existed. That's why somebody who converts to Judaism, their Jewish name is going to be son or daughter of Abraham and Sarah, right? They're still going to have, warm feelings for their birth parents, but under Jewish law, their birth parents are no longer their parents. It doesn't mean you can't talk to them or, spend holidays with them. Well, that's something else. It's not that you're going to sever your relationship with them. It's just as a legal matter, your relatives are no longer your relatives. You are like a newborn when you convert to Judaism. And that's why they wouldn't make this woman, if she, converted at that moment and became a convert, she doesn't have to wait. She can marry a guy then. And likewise for a woman coming out of slavery. However, an Israelite female minor need not wait 3 months in any case. And the Gemara, that's because she could not have become pregnant. And the Gemara clarifies with regard to what situation is this statement referring. It is referring to a female minor released from her marriage by refusal, right? That's something that a minor who was married without her consent by her mother or her brothers or her father, I think only mother and brothers, the father was dead. And then she can refuse her husband until the time that she becomes an adult. When she spends 1 day with him as an adult, then she is married, and to leave that marriage is going to require a bill of divorce. Until then, she can unilaterally leave the marriage. So if it is referring to a female minor released from her marriage by refusal, it would be superfluous, as didn't Shmuel already state this law one time? If it is referring to a woman released by a bill of divorce, a get, but didn't Shmuel say that in that case she is required to wait? As Shmuel said, if she refused him, she need not wait 3 months, but if he gave her a bill of divorce, she must wait 3 months. So any woman who gets a bill of divorce must wait 3 months until she remarries. Rather, this is referring to cases of promiscuous sexual intercourse, and an occurrence of promiscuous sexual intercourse with female minors is uncommon, and the sages did not issue rabbinic decrees in uncommon instances. This is a little bit confusing. When they're talking about promiscuous sexual intercourse, it's not adultery, so I think they're talking about a single woman who has premarital sex, so that's promiscuous. Now, how could that apply to a minor, right? It seems to me that a minor, if a minor has sex, it's always rape. So I'm not sure why they're calling it that, but in any case, it's uncommon. It's an uncommon occurrence, right? Because even if she somehow, wanted it and made it happen, it's still rape. But I'm not sure how this is playing out. Let's just keep reading. So the Gemara suggests, let the sages issue a decree requiring a female convert and a released maidservant, or a released female slave, to wait 3 months, as at the time that one was a Gentile and that the other was a slave, promiscuous sexual intercourse was common for them. This is not to say that the sages believe that all non-Jews are promiscuous. It's just that they're saying they don't know, what slaves are doing and what's common for non-Jews. So it might be that they were promiscuous, and they have to, treat the law accordingly. The Gemara responds, Shmuel stated his halachic ruling in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, as it is taught in a baraisa, in the case of the female convert and the captured woman, right? A woman captured in war, who is suspected of having been raped during her imprisonment, and the maidservant, who were redeemed or who were converted or who were released. They must all wait 3 months prior to marriage, because it's possible that they're already pregnant, and we need to know that. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef allows them to be betrothed and married immediately. And Rabbi said, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yosef? Since he knows they might be pregnant, why is he allowing them to get married right away? He holds that a woman who engages in promiscuous sexual intercourse uses a contraceptive resorbent that she places at the opening of her womb so as not to become impregnated. Therefore, there is no concern that she might be pregnant. It's interesting because, as far as I know, in ancient times, they had no reliable contraceptives, but they clearly had contraceptives that, enough so that it entered into this discussion. So, if there's a reason to believe, or a high probability at least, that she's not pregnant, then there's no reason to issue that decree that she must wait 3 months, according to Rabbi Yosef. So Abaye said to him, granted, a female convert does this. She uses the contraceptive. Why? Since she is determined to become a Jew, she guards herself so as not to be impregnated while still a Gentile, in order to distinguish between children conceived in sanctity, in other words, after her conversion, and children conceived out of sanctity, meaning before her conversion. So a captured woman and a slave would also be cautious because they hear from their masters that they are about to be redeemed or that they are about to be released, and so they guard themselves so as not to become impregnated. However, with regard to a maidservant who is suddenly released due to damage caused her by her masters, for example, the loss of a tooth or an eye, and then they have to free her. So how can you find a case where there is no concern for her becoming impregnated? Since she could not have known in advance that she would be released, she would have had no reason to be careful not to become pregnant. And if you say that in any case where the situation occurs by itself, as in the case where a woman was unaware of her pending release, Rabbi Yosef concedes that she must indeed wait This is difficult. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah? A woman who was raped and a woman who was seduced must wait 3 months, as perhaps she became pregnant. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef permits her to be betrothed and to be married immediately. Clearly, a woman who was raped could not have prepared herself ahead of time so as not to become pregnant, and yet Rabbi Yosef allows her to become betrothed and to marry immediately. He's not concerned that she was already pregnant when she entered the marriage, and then we wouldn't know who the father is. Why? So rather, Abaye said we must be misunderstanding the Baraisa that we're talking about. Rather, a woman who engages in promiscuous sexual intercourse turns over following intercourse, trying to prevent the absorption of the semen so as not to become pregnant. So whatever this technique was that they had available in ancient times, it has the effect of like a morning after pill. Like even after the sex, it's going to prevent conception. Now, we could say, well, that must have been so unreliable as that we would just dismiss it. But they didn't make this up out of nowhere, right? Just like the other day we talked about that the sages had a tradition that a woman doesn't become pregnant the very first time of intercourse unless there's some kind of other circumstances going on. And I think there was some discussion in the comments, that's ridiculous. So let's say that definitely contradicts our understanding of what's reliable and what's not, what is preventable and what's not, the kind of statistics that we're used to dealing with. Nevertheless, the sages wouldn't have come up with a teaching like that randomly that has no observed and no observable validity in the world, at least as it was 2,000 years ago. So there was something to it, right? It may not square with our understanding of human sexuality. Nevertheless, there was something to it. So they had some kind of a technique that these women would do if they, had sex, that they weren't supposed to have, or they were raped, or it was, illicit sex, or for whatever reason, they didn't want to get pregnant from it. So they had some kind of post-coital technique to avoid pregnancy. So, and female slaves act in a similar manner. So the Gemara asks, if indeed she tries not to become pregnant, well, how then would the other opinion, that of Rabbi Yehuda, explain why she must wait 3 months? And the Gemara responds, we are concerned that perhaps she did not turn over well enough and therefore became pregnant. And the law follows Rabbi Yehuda. So it seems like, there was a reason to think that women would do something so they would avoid becoming pregnant, but it wasn't reliable enough. And so the law follows Rabbi Yehuda, says you can't rely on that. So the woman, after having had those relations, should wait 3 months before she gets married, and has sex with her new husband. And so they would know if the previous relations resulted in pregnancy or not. So with regard to the case of two betrothed women who were switched at the time they entered the wedding canopy, meaning our Mishna, that we're now concluding the discussion of it, and if they were daughters of priests, so they are disqualified from partaking in teruma. They had extramarital sex, so the daughter of a priest can eat food that is consecrated, teruma, that can only be eaten by priests and their household. But a woman who had extramarital sex, whether she's the daughter or the wife of a priest, can no longer eat teruma. And the Gemara asks, does this indicate that with regard to the daughters of priests, yes, they are disqualified from partaking in teruma? But with regard to the daughter of an Israelite, no, she would not be disqualified. It would seem that an Israelite woman married to a priest should most certainly be disqualified from eating of her husband's teruma. And the Gemara answers rather, say, if they were the wives of priests, then they are disqualified. The Gemara questions this formulation. Does this indicate that with regard to the wives of priests, yes, they are disqualified, but with regard to the wives of Israelites, no, they are disqualified, and if their husbands died, they would be suitable for marriage to the priests? And the Gemara objects to this. But didn't Rav Amram say? Rav Shesha said this matter to us, and he lit our eyes by showing us that this ruling is indicated from what was stated in the Mishnah on page 53. He said, the wife of an Israelite who was raped, even though she is permitted to return to her husband, she is nevertheless disqualified from the priesthood. She cannot marry a priest. right? Because a priest cannot marry a divorcee, but he could marry a widow. And here we're learning, unfortunately, a priest cannot marry a victim of rape. If her husband later dies, she may not marry a priest, for although she is permitted to her husband, the rape disqualified her for matters of priesthood. Now, obviously, that sounds terribly unfair, but it's also unfair that a priest who had a blemish, like he had an accident and a part of his finger got cut off, wasn't his fault, terrible thing, might have been completely not his fault, no negligence involved, but now he's a blemished priest and he cannot serve in the temple. You know, it's not about your feelings, right? It's just about, that's the law. That's a strict liability issue. So Rava resolved this and said, this is what the Tana is saying in the Mishnah. If they were daughters of priests who were married to an Israelite, they are disqualified from the teruma, that is from the household of their fathers. So if their husbands die while they are childless, they may not go back and eat the teruma in the house of their fathers. While other childless daughters of priests are again qualified to eat of the teruma the moment they leave their Israelite husbands, these women were disqualified by the act of forbidden sexual intercourse, even though it was unwilling on their part. That concludes our discussion of chapter 3. Now we move on to chapter 4. Now what's interesting about chapter 4 is we're going to look at another series of cases, but now we've been assuming that always, right, why were we performing yibum? Because a man died without having children, and he had a widow, and he had a brother. Right? And then there might have been other wives and other brothers and co-wives and previous wives, etc. But the given was always that the man was childless. What if he had a child? Well, then there's no yibum. Why would you even ask the question? If he had a child, yibum does not apply. But what if you're not sure if he had a child? Or, for example, if his wife was pregnant or maybe was pregnant, or she didn't seem to be pregnant, but we later learned that she was pregnant. Now, if she's pregnant, does yibum apply? You would think not, right? Because there's the possibility that he's going to have a child, and if he has a child, then there's no yibum, right? He's the one who fathered that child, even though it wasn't born at the time of his death. So this is going to add a whole new layer of wrinkles, ramifications, nuances, possibilities to the question of when yibum and when chalitzah applies or doesn't apply. So let's open. We're on 35b, beginning of chapter 4, Mishnah number 1. When a man who has a brother dies childless, his widow, his Yevama, and one of his brothers, the Yavam, may perform a ritual through which she is freed from her levirate bonds, and that's chalitzah. It is then considered with regard to forbidden relationships as though they had been married and divorced, right? Now that she's performed chalitzah with her Yavam, she's known as a chalutza, and she may not marry a priest because she's now, even though she was never divorced, it's like she was divorced. A chalitzah is taken like a divorce, so she's disqualified from marrying a priest. I mean, it's such a tiny subset of the Jewish people. It's not that big a hardship, but we understand what the ruling is. However, with regard to one, it is then considered with regard to forbidden relationships as though they had been married and divorced. Therefore, he is forbidden to her relatives and she to his. So the Yavam and the Yavama who perform chalitzah, because there was a period where they had a levirate bond and then they severed the bond through chalitzah, for certain areas of Jewish law, it's considered like they were married and divorced. One area is with regard to her marrying a priest, but also, for example, he cannot marry her sister, right? He cannot marry her sister because it's like he was married to this woman and divorced, and now he cannot marry her sister. So other kinds of forbidden relatives, it's going to take effect as if they were married and then divorced. However, with regard to one who performs chalitzah with his Yevama, and then she is found to have been pregnant at the time of the chalitzah. Who made her pregnant? Obviously her husband, who died. The Yavam never slept with her. They didn't perform yibum, they performed chalitzah. So she was pregnant at the time of the chalitzah with a child conceived with her husband, who died. They didn't know that she was pregnant at the time they performed the chalitzah, and later they found out she was pregnant. So what then? With regard to one who performs chalitzah with his yevama, and then she is found to have been pregnant at the time of the chalitzah, and she gave birth, in the event that the offspring is viable, right? So it has to be viable offspring, which basically means they're going to live more than 30 days. So then the deceased husband has been survived by offspring, and so there was never any levirate bond. Consequently, the chalitzah that was performed was entirely unnecessary. It was a meaningless act. They never had a levirate bond, so the chalitzah ritual that they went through didn't have any ramifications at all. It was meaningless. As such, he remains permitted to her relatives, and she remains permitted to his relatives. She wasn't a woman that was married and divorced. She was widowed from the husband. Nothing happened with his brother, and now she's still permitted as a widow to marry a priest, though she cannot marry the high priest. Furthermore, since the chalitzah was meaningless, she is not afforded the status of a chalutza, i.e. a yevama who performed chalitzah, status akin to that of a divorcee. Therefore, the chalitzah does not disqualify her from marrying into the priesthood. If the offspring, she was pregnant and then the baby was born, but it was not viable, it died right away or was stillborn, then it emerges that the chalitzah was indeed necessary. He did die without a child. Therefore, he is forbidden to engage in relations with her relatives, and she is forbidden to engage in relations with his relatives, as though they had been married and divorced, and the chalitzah disqualifies her from marrying into the priesthood because she becomes a chalutza. With regard to one who consummates the levirate marriage with his yevama, i.e. he had intercourse with her under the assumption that there is a levirate bond, and so there is a mitzvah to do so, and then she is found to have been pregnant at the time of the intercourse. How would that happen? Like, what do you mean? Like, how do you know she was pregnant by the husband and not by the yavam? I think that it would be something like the guy dies, and then they get around to performing the yibum, let's say 4 months later, right? Or even 5 months later. Or she's not showing. So maybe 4 months and somehow she's not showing. And then 5 months later, a baby is born and it's a full-term baby. So they realize that she was pregnant at the time that they performed yibum. She must have been pregnant. It wasn't from their yibum that, 5 months later, a full-term baby is born. And then she is found to have been pregnant at the time of the intercourse, and she gave birth. So in the event that the offspring is viable, the deceased brother has been survived by offspring. And it is evident that there never was a levirate bond. So now there was a transgression. The yavam slept with his brother's wife. There was no yibum, right? So there was no yibum because she had a child by the husband. In that case, the relations they had, rather than being a mitzvah, were a violation of the prohibition against engaging relations with one's brother's wife. Therefore, the yavam must send her out. They must separate. They cannot be married. She is forbidden to him as his brother's wife, and to atone for the forbidden relations that they had, they are each obligated to bring a sin offering, as is the law for all who inadvertently transgress a prohibition that, if it were performed intentionally, would be punishable by karas, death at the hands of the heavenly court. And if the offspring is not viable, and therefore there was in fact a levirate bond, so then he may keep her as his wife, since his intercourse with her was a valid consummation of levirate marriage. If they consummated the levirate marriage, and 7 months later she gave birth, right? Now here's where it gets tricky. So if 5 months later she gave birth to a full-term baby, hey, okay, clearly she was pregnant from the husband at that time. But if she had yibum not so long after her husband died, and 7 months after that, a baby is born, okay, now you're unsure. Who is the father of that baby? Was it the original husband, or was it the yavam? What then? Here there is uncertainty whether the child is 9 months old, i.e. counting from conception, and is the offspring of the first husband, and as such there was no levirate bond, and the sleeping together was a transgression and there was no yibum, or whether the child is only 7 months old and is the offspring of the latter husband, i.e. the yavam, and not of the deceased, in which case there is a levirate bond. In that case, Due to the possibility that she is forbidden to him as his brother's wife, he must send her out. However, the lineage of the child is unflawed, since regardless of whether it was born of the first or second husband, there was no transgression involved in its conception. Furthermore, to atone for the possibility that they had forbidden relations, they are both obligated to bring a guilt offering, not a chatas, but an asham. What is a guilt offering? You bring it when you're not sure if you committed a transgression that would result in a sin offering or not. In those cases, you bring the guilt offering. So they are both obligated to bring a guilt offering for uncertainty, as is the law for anyone who is uncertain whether they inadvertently transgressed a prohibition that would require one to bring a sin offering. The Gemara. An Amoraic dispute, right, the sages of the Gemara, was stated with regard to one who performs chalitzah with a pregnant woman and she later miscarried. Since she miscarried, she was certainly bound to the Yavam by a levirate bond, right? The miscarriage shows that there was no child from the first husband. He died childless. She might have been pregnant, but it wasn't a viable offspring, so he was not, he did not have a child. He did not father a child in his lifetime. So they do have a levirate obligation. Okay, but they performed chalitzah while she was pregnant. Since she miscarried, she was certainly bound to the Yavam by a levirate bond, and she may not marry anyone else. Rather, she's obligated to consummate the yibum or perform chalitzah. So the question is whether the chalitzah that was performed while she was still pregnant is effective in releasing her from the levirate bond. You would think that retroactively, once you realize that the child was not viable, that chalitzah should count. But this is a matter of dispute. Rabbi Yochanan said she does not require another chalitzah from the brothers. That chalitzah was a valid chalitzah and she's done. Reish Lakish said she requires chalitzah from the brothers, either this brother or another of the brothers. And the Gemara elaborates. Rabbi Yochanan said that she does not require another chalitzah from the brothers because he holds chalitzah performed with a pregnant woman who later miscarries is chalitzah in order to release her from the bond, the levirate bond. And similarly, intercourse with a pregnant woman who later miscarries is considered yibum. Right? So if you have sex with a woman, you didn't know she was pregnant, later it turned out that she was pregnant, but she miscarried, okay. So it doesn't matter that she was impregnated by her husband before he died, that it was not viable offspring, then she performed yibum with her yavam, they're now married, right? They're married, valid yibum. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, whether it's chalitzah or yibum, with a woman who turned out to be pregnant by her original husband, but the baby never came to term or was born dead, she miscarried, so then it's a valid chalitzah or a valid yibum. And Reish Lakish said, no, she requires another chalitzah from the brothers. Why? Because he holds that chalitzah with a pregnant woman is not chalitzah, and intercourse with a pregnant woman is not yibum. Therefore, after she miscarries, another chalitzah must be performed in order to release her from the levirate bond. Now, with regard to what principle is it that they disagree? If you wish, say that they disagree over the interpretation of a verse, and if you wish, say that they disagree on a point of logical reasoning. If you wish, say that they disagree over a point of logical reasoning, in that Rabbi Yochanan holds, if Elijah the prophet were to come at the moment of chalitzah and say that this woman who is pregnant will miscarry, right? If you had advanced diagnostic techniques, or if you had a prophet who would come to you and tell you what the future holds. So if you knew that she was going to miscarry, says Rabbi Yochanan, so if you knew that if Elijah the prophet came and told you at the moment that they're performing the chalitzah that she's pregnant but she will miscarry, then she is not eligible for chalitzah or levirate marriage, even though she is currently pregnant, since her husband died and will not be survived by offspring. Wait a minute. If Elijah the prophet were to come at the moment of chalitzah and say that this woman who is pregnant will miscarry, is she not eligible for chalitzah or levirate marriage? It's a question. Of course she is. That's the point. Rabbi Yochanan is saying if you knew that she's going to miscarry, Well, then the husband died childless. She requires yibum or chalitzah. So if you knew that at this moment, of course you would say valid chalitzah or valid yibum. So now too, even though when the chalitzah or yibum is performed, it is not known whether or not she will miscarry, well, the matter is going to be revealed in the end, and then we'll know what was going on at this moment, i.e., if she ultimately miscarries, then it is apparent that the chalitzah or the levirate marriage was always necessary and is therefore valid. If later it turns out that the child is born, okay, then it was a meaningless chalitzah, and you can deal with it at that time because no yibum was required. They'll bring a sin offering, and they'll be done. That's it. Well, if they perform yibum, they'll bring a sin offering. If they perform chalitzah, it was a meaningless chalitzah, no harm done. They go their separate ways. So why wouldn't you count the chalitzah as valid if it turns out later that the baby is not viable? Now, what does Reish Lakish say? And Reish Lakish said, we do not say that the matter will be revealed retroactively in order to validate the levirate marriage or chalitzah. Since at the time of the levirate marriage or chalitzah, it was still unknown whether she would miscarry, the act is considered premature. And because it's premature, it is ineffective, and we're going to need a chalitzah or a yibum when the matter is known, right? So we're going to need that later. Now, because we're doing a double daf, I'm going to skip forward. So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish will go back and forth on the question, is chalitzah with a pregnant woman a valid chalitzah? Right? And hold on a second. Chalitzah with a pregnant woman, I'll just tell you what the law is. In the case of one who performs chalitzah with his yevama, and then she is found to have been pregnant at the time, even if the offspring is not viable, the chalitzah is considered ineffective. And another chalitzah must be performed. And some say it may be performed either with the brother who originally performed the chalitzah with her or with any of the other brothers. Others argue that this chalitzah may be performed only with one of the other brothers. So Reish Lakish won this battle. Okay, we're skipping forward. Now we get into 36. Now we're doing page 36 on the A side. I'm just going to read a couple of halachas. One we've already seen. Whenever a woman is ineligible to consummate a levirate marriage, she is also ineligible to perform chalitzah. And the co-wife of a pregnant yevama, if a yevama who is pregnant with a child from her deceased husband consummates a levirate marriage or performs chalitzah, her co-wife is prohibited from remarrying until the child is born. As we've seen, the status of, if the man died and he had two wives, so the status of the wives are linked to each other. If one of them is exempt from yibum and chalitzah, so is the other one. If one of them performs yibum or chalitzah, the other one becomes exempt at that moment too. Here, where we have to discover whether there was a viable child or not, to know whether yibum was required or not, the co-wife is going to have to wait to see the result of that pregnancy. So we skip forward a bit. We're near the bottom of 36a. Rava said, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish in these three disputes. Right, so Reish Lakish won the argument, and now Rava is telling us Reish Lakish won this argument, and he won two other arguments also. And it's actually a bit of a digression from the law of yibum. So one, this dispute that we already stated with regard to the chalitzah of a pregnant woman, it is not a valid chalitzah. The other dispute concerns that which we learned in a Mishna. In the case of one who verbally divides up his possessions among his descendants, stating how he wishes his estate to be divided after his death, if he increases the proportion of his estate that should go to one of his children, or decreases the proportion of his estate that should go to another one of his children, or if he equally distributes between them the double portion of the firstborn, then his words are binding, right? So the Torah says that if a person dies and he hasn't made a will, so the firstborn gets a double portion and all the rest of the children get equal portions of what's left. But if he said explicitly that the receipt of these portions should be considered as an inheritance, then it is as though the verbal division of his property that he said is nothing, i.e. it is non-binding. since his words directly contradict the laws of inheritance as they're written in the Torah. However, if he wrote a will, and somewhere therein he wrote, whether at the beginning or at the end or in the middle, that the receipt of the portions should be considered as a gift rather than an inheritance, as opposed to inheritance, then his words are binding. Now we're on the B side. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan dispute whether one must state that the receipt of the portions should be considered as a gift with regard to each recipient, or whether stating it with regard to one of them is enough to indicate that it is true for all. And Reish Lakish said, the inheritors will only ever acquire the portions as defined by the owner of the possessions once he says, so and so shall inherit such and such a field that I have given to them as a gift, and they shall inherit them. I.e., he must state explicitly for each recipient that their receipt of the portions should be considered a gift. And Rava ruled that in this dispute as well, the law is in accordance with Reish Lakish. Right? You can't call it an inheritance because you're changing how the Torah would have you inherit your children. Right? But you can always give your property as a gift to whoever you want. It's your property. You can do that. So you can make gifts to your children that take effect after your death as long as it's worded properly. It's one of those, legal technicalities that it has to be called a gift and not an inheritance. And the other dispute, the third dispute, where the law follows Reish Lakish over Rabbi Yochanan. Remember that Rabbi Yochanan is the one who elevated Reish Lakish from a bandit into a sage. Through many decades of education. But Reish Lakish was absolutely brilliant. He was still junior to Rabbi Yochanan. He was the most gifted of the sages of the generation other than Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan loved him and felt that after Reish Lakish died, he had no one with whom he could really learn effectively. Unfortunately, they had a falling out before Reish Lakish's death, and Rabbi Yochanan regretted it until his own. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan was senior to Reish Lakish, and in their disputes, the law follows Rabbi Yochanan with these exceptions, and this is 3 of them. So the third case concerns that which we learned in a Mishnah in the case of one who writes a bill transferring ownership of all of his possessions to his son and stating that the transfer should take effect immediately so that the son should gain the rights to use the possession after his death. Then although the father retained for himself the right to use the possessions until his death, he is unable to sell the possessions due to the fact that he gave them to his son. This is actually like a way to avoid estate tax, right? Rather than wait till your death and your kids inherit you. So, it's a modern law, right? That you start giving things to your children before you die, not as an inheritance, but as a gift. Now, you want to still live in your own house, even though you gave it to your son. So you retain that right to live in your house. But because you gave your son the deed, now you can't sell your house. It's not yours anymore. You retain the use of it, but you didn't retain the ownership of it. So he is unable to sell the possessions due to the fact that he gave them to the son. And the son is unable to sell the possessions due to the fact that they are still in the father's possession. The father's still living there, so the son can't sell the house either. So if the father sold the possessions, even though he wasn't supposed to, then they are sold to the extent that the purchaser may use them until the father dies. If the son sold the possessions during his father's lifetime, the purchaser does not receive any rights to use the possessions until the father dies. And an Amoraic dispute was stated in the case in which the son sold the possessions during the father's lifetime. And then the son died during the father's lifetime, following which the father died as well. In that case, Rabbi Yochanan said the purchaser does not acquire anything. And Reish Lakish said the purchaser does acquire the possessions. And then they explore the ramifications of, it's okay. So the Gemara explains their reasoning. Rabbi Yochanan said the purchaser does not acquire anything because he holds that the ownership of the rights to an item and its produce is tantamount to the ownership of the item itself, i.e. the actual title to it. Since the father retained the rights to use the possessions until his death, as long as he lives, he's considered as if he holds title. Therefore, the son's sale can be effective only after the father's death, at which point the son becomes the title owner. However, if the son dies first, then Since he never gained the title to the items, his sale can never come to fruition, according to Rabbi Yochanan. And Reish Lakish said the purchaser does acquire possessions, as Reish Lakish holds that the ownership of the rights to an item and its produce is not tantamount to the ownership of the item, the actual title. Therefore, although the father is still alive, the son immediately gains the full title to the possessions, which he may sell to someone else. Nevertheless, since the father retains the rights to use the possessions, the purchaser may use the possessions he acquired only when the father dies. Okay, now let's get back to yibum, right? So our Mishna, the first Mishna of chapter 4, stated that if a Yavam consummates a levirate marriage with his Yevama while she is pregnant, if it emerges that the offspring is not viable, then he may maintain her as his wife because the intercourse with her was a valid consummation of levirate marriage. It wasn't a viable offspring, so the man, the original husband who died, was childless, remained childless, and his widow comes before his brother for yibum, and they perform yibum. Beautiful, perfect. They did the right thing, so now they can stay married. An opposing opinion is taught in a baraisa. In the name of Rabbi Eliezer, they said, no, he must send her out with a bill of divorce. Although it emerged that the levirate marriage took effect, since at the time that he consummated the levirate marriage, it was prohibited to do so because the Yevama was pregnant, he is therefore penalized and required to separate from her. And Rava said, Rabbi Meir, and this would be a reason that you don't perform yibum so quick after the brother dies. You should wait 3 months to make sure she's not pregnant to avoid this case. Now, this is the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, if they perform yibum and it turns out she was pregnant, then it doesn't matter that the baby turns out to be non-viable. They have to divorce no matter what. Good incentive to wait. Rava said, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer said the same thing, i.e. they both expressed the same opinion, that if one marries a woman whom he is prohibited from marrying, he is penalized and required to divorce her, even if the reason for the prohibition no longer applies. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion was expressed in this ruling that we just stated. Where was Rabbi Meir's opinion expressed? As it is taught in a baraisa, a man may not marry a woman who is pregnant with the child of another man, nor a woman who is nursing the child of another man. And if he transgressed and married her, he is penalized for violating the prohibition, and he must divorce her with a bill of divorce, and he may never take her back. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. You don't marry a pregnant woman. You can marry a single mother, no problem, and obviously it's laudable, beautiful. But you shouldn't marry a pregnant woman. And the sages say he must send her out. When the time comes in which he is permitted to marry her, after the child is weaned, he may then marry her again. Right? So Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer say, if you married a pregnant woman, we make them divorce and they can never marry again. But the sages say, no, we send them out. They can't be married. It was invalid to marry her while she was pregnant. But after the child is weaned, right, born and then weaned, nursed and then stops nursing, then they can marry again and be together. We're not even talking about yibum here. Just generally speaking, a Jewish man should not marry a pregnant woman. Abaye said to him, from where do you deduce that they are of one opinion? Wait a minute. Yeah, right. And Abaye said to him, from where do you deduce that they are of one opinion? Eliezer and Meir. Perhaps that is not so, as it is possible that Rabbi Eliezer states his ruling only here, in the case of a Yavam, who consummated a levirate marriage with his Yevama while she was still pregnant, due to the fact that by doing so, he risks the possibility that the offspring will be viable, in which case he encounters the Torah prohibition against engaging in relations with one's brother's wife. However, there, in the case where one married a woman who is pregnant with the child of some other man, which is a rabbinic prohibition, it is possible that Rabbi Eliezer holds in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir. Alternatively, it is also possible that Rabbi Meir states his ruling only there, in the case where one married a woman who is pregnant with the child of another man, due to the fact that doing so is a violation of a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore it is possible that this is one of the cases in which the sages reinforce their pronouncements with greater severity than the prohibitions of Torah law, so that people would not treat them lightly. However, Here, in the case of a Yavam who consummated a levirate marriage with his Yevama while she was still pregnant, where there was a risk of transgressing a prohibition written in the Torah, since people are generally careful to distance themselves from a Torah prohibition, there is no need to further penalize someone who nevertheless transgressed. And so, Rabbi Meir might agree with the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. And Rava said, and I'm almost done, so you got questions or comments, get them in. Rava said, according to the statement of the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Meir and require one who married a pregnant woman to send her out, the intention is that he must send her out with a bill of divorce and not merely separate from her. Mar Zutra said, the language the rabbis used is also precise, as they teach he must send her out, and they do not teach he must separate herself from her. Conclude from here that Rava's claim is correct. Okay. Good work, people. We covered 2 pages. Let us see if there are questions or comments here on Yevamos 35 and 36. I see. Nina had to leave to take my daughter to a friend's house. So let me scan for comments myself. Okay, it's always hard to just, read and choose questions. I can't even see very well, but I'll do my best. Sharon, if a woman has intercourse with a Yavam very rapidly after her widowhood, how is it possible to know who is the father exactly? Does it matter anyway, since the first child she has is considered the child of the first husband? Right, but why would it matter? No, but you see why it matters, because if it was the first man's child, then the act of sleeping with the Yavam was not yibum, right? It was just a transgression, since her husband did die with children, right? He had a viable child in the works, and that's the big difference that it makes, and that's why they make her wait. Sharon, we are going through this now with a cousin who died without a will. So now we're talking about this other disagreement between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and whether it's considered, can a man in his will, redistribute the wealth among the children, not according to Torah law, which is double portion for the oldest, equal for everyone else. He can if he calls it a gift to each of the children, but if he calls it an inheritance, then he's contradicting Torah law, and they set it aside. Here in modern times, Sharon says, we're going through this now with a cousin who died without a will. We are outside of the consideration, but are trying to help out her ex and her daughter. It's a mess. Bill, so deeply odd but strangely heartwarming thing happening right now. A friend sent me a video call, not realizing I was in class. And now he's decided he finds it fascinating. He's just quietly sitting and listening in through my phone. Wonderful. You are welcome, sir. I'm glad to have you with us. Okay, and then was there a question over here? Okay, and I think that's it in the way of questions. What is this? Yosef, I could be wrong, but it appears that the Torah says that the woman must make it clear that this violent crime has taken place, or one can assume she is complicit. Okay, so there you're referring to the promiscuous relations, right? When we're talking about a minor, any sex with a minor is rape. But there's this interesting thing. It's not part of the laws of yibum, but just one of the laws in the Torah that, if a woman had an opportunity to scream out and prevent it, and the man forced himself on her, so it's rape. But if she didn't, cry out and try to stop it, it's not rape. I mean, these are definitely archaic, from another world type of laws. But I guess what you're getting at is the distinction in the sage's eyes, whether whether she was complicit in some kind of extramarital or premarital sex or not, right? So when they were talking about licentious behavior, I mean, those kinds of cases can be heartbreaking and very difficult. And I think it's not a question of the evidence that's brought to bear, whether, it was an act of seduction, legitimate seduction, illegitimate seduction, rape, or just promiscuity. In terms of proving that, we'll come to that in another area of the Talmud. Here, they're just talking about if it was rape, she's permitted to go back to her husband. Right, because it's not her fault. But if it was not rape, if she participated in it in some way of her own volition, then she would no longer be permitted to her husband. I mean, adultery is such a serious sin that even if the husband said he's okay with it, it's not okay, right? They can't, that halachically they would have to break up. So that's some of the ramifications of that area of law. Sharon said, I thought even if a child is born, it is not considered viable for 3 years. I haven't heard that teaching. I thought it was 30 days, except, that a Jewish baby is not considered viable until it graduates from medical school. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. No class tomorrow, as I published in the schedule. I've got my father coming to town, and we've got an event tomorrow night. So we'll do the double daf on Thursday, and then no class possible on Friday, as we're in the final preparations for Pesach, for Passover. So then we won't have class Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we'll gather again on Monday. But the next class is Thursday night, and we'll do a double daf on Thursday with God's help.